Fort Norton's subterranean corridors held the kind of cold that seeped into every breath. Captain Adam Grayson stood beside a fluorescent lamp, scanning the classified orders labeled Operation Beast. The text outlined a recent pattern of violent attacks in Montana's remote woodlands. The victims displayed extensive lacerations and missing limbs. Authorities suspected a predatory animal, but there was no confirmation. Delta 7, Grayson's 6-person special operations team, awaited his instructions. They had encountered hostile insurgents and rogue paramilitaries, but this assignment was unusual. The briefing materials offered minimal data, focusing mostly on the confidentiality of the mission. The orders demanded complete operational secrecy and immediate execution. The document contained a satellite photograph of a small town near a dense forest. It was labeled "Evacuated for Chemical Hazard." Grayson noticed a discrepancy. There were no visible decontamination stations, no standard quarantine apparatus, and no sign of specialized response teams. He found that puzzling. He did not voice doubts. Chain of command expected obedience. The team's objective was to locate and eliminate the source of the attacks. The official reason for evacuation involved a hazardous spill at an old chemical plant, but the text omitted essential details. National security concerns overshadowed everything else. Beside Grayson stood 2 civilian researchers wearing plain uniforms without insignias. They introduced themselves simply as Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes, specialists in biological analysis. They offered no background information regarding their fields of expertise. The orders called them valuable mission assets, though they refused to elaborate. In the armory, Delta 7 discovered that their standard ammunition was replaced with special rounds. The quartermaster explained that these bullets contained high-velocity cores of steel and silver. They were not typical gear for conventional engagements. Grayson questioned the necessity of precious metal, but the quartermaster insisted it was mandated by top-level command. Grayson's instincts sharpened. Wildlife threats did not usually require exotic ammunition. He recalled older reports of clandestine programs involving enhanced organisms, rumored to be part of experimental warfare research. Officially, such rumors had been denied. Yet the presence of silver components in lethal rounds hinted at a deeper truth. Before departure, the team performed final checks. Sergeant Klein verified the radio frequencies. Corporal Davis loaded the modified magazines. Private Tories stowed extra medical supplies. Grayson inspected the mission roster. Each soldier carried standard rifles, sidearms, and newly issued protective gear. The scientist packed portable lab equipment, including sealed sample containers. The official timeline allowed no delay. A military helicopter awaited on the surface. Its rotors droned against the crisp Colorado morning. Grayson led his squad up the elevator shaft to the staging area. Outside, the temperature was low and the wind stung exposed skin. They boarded quickly. There was no ceremonial send-off. Inside the helicopter's cargo hold, the mood was controlled. The rotating blades produced a steady vibration through the metal floor. Grayson maintained his composure, absorbing the final directive: investigate, neutralize, and report. The pilot acknowledged their heading, confirming an approximate flight time to Montana of 2 hours. Fuel reserves were sufficient. Dr. Sandoval sat across from Grayson, securing a black case. Dr. Rhodes quietly checked vials of unknown chemicals. Neither scientist seemed concerned about conventional contamination hazards. Grayson did not pry. The mission brief left no room for distractions. He realized something significant was being withheld, but he upheld professional discipline. Halfway through the flight, radio traffic from command reiterated the secrecy clause. All field reports would be routed through encrypted channels. Grayson communicated with base operations, confirming the team's readiness. The confirmation was sterile. He sensed an undercurrent of tension behind every directive. The conversation ended without clarifying critical points. As the helicopter neared Montana, the pilot received clearance to land on an abandoned athletic field outside the deserted town. Grayson peered through the window. No movement was visible along the streets. Vehicles sat idle, and the morning sun revealed boarded-up windows. According to the official briefing, the populace had left due to toxic hazards. He could not ignore the inconsistencies. A standard chemical disaster zone would have protective barriers and evacuation checkpoints. The images from overhead reconnaissance had shown none of those. Grayson prepared himself. He instructed the team to disembark. Their operation would begin immediately. Grayson stepped onto the frosty ground, feeling the weight of the assignment. He signaled the pilot to remain on standby for rapid extraction. The scientists followed, carrying sealed containers and scanning the silent surroundings. Delta 7 fanned out, securing a perimeter. The mission to confront an unknown threat was officially underway now. The helicopter lifted off behind Delta 7, leaving the team and 2 scientists on a silent football field coated with a faint layer of frost. Captain Grayson surveyed the surroundings. Houses stood with windows boarded up and empty vehicles lined the streets. There was no official containment zone, no sign of hazard crews, and no odor suggesting chemical spillage. Grayson signaled Corporal Davis to check the immediate area. Davis moved quickly, weapon at the ready, scanning for signs of civilian life. Sergeant Klein relayed radio communications back to Fort Norton, indicating the team had landed and was establishing a base of operations. Command acknowledged the transmission but provided no additional orders. Grayson sensed a deliberate gap in information. He walked toward the old police station, a structure of faded brick and chipped paint. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, dust particles hovered in beams of pale light. Broken glass littered the floor, and bullet impacts scarred the walls. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes entered behind Grayson, stepping carefully around debris. There were no bodies, but evidence of conflict was obvious. Grayson noticed smear marks on the floor near an overturned desk. He instructed Private Torres to photograph the damage. She captured images of the shattered windows and the bullet casings scattered across one corner. None of this had been mentioned in the briefing documents. The official reports suggested a simple evacuation, yet the shredded upholstery and impact marks implied an armed struggle. Klein's voice came through the radio, confirming the building was clear. Grayson directed the team to set up a temporary command post inside the reception area. Davis and Torres dragged a few intact chairs into position. Dr. Sandoval requested a small, separate space to install portable lab equipment. Grayson granted permission, ordering Sergeant Klein to assist with the heavier gear. Outside, sunlight reflected off empty storefronts and vacant streets. The day was cold and quiet. Corporal Davis deployed a compact drone from the station's entrance. The device buzzed upward, transmitting real-time video to a handheld monitor. Dr. Rhodes observed the feed, scrutinizing the deserted town blocks. Grayson watched the display, noticing broken windows and scattered belongings that suggested a rushed evacuation. After a few minutes of aerial surveillance, the drone moved toward the forest boundary. The camera revealed a winding tree line with heavy undergrowth. Patches of snow clung to the ground in shaded areas. No movement was visible at first, but Dr. Rhodes pointed out a dark shape between the pines. Before the operator could focus on it, the signal cut out. The screen turned static. Davis attempted to re-establish contact with the drone. Grayson took note of the sudden malfunction. That area of the forest was roughly 1 mile north of their location, according to the drone's last GPS coordinate. Klein proposed sending a small reconnaissance team to check. Grayson agreed. He designated Klein and Private Torres for the mission, instructing them to retrieve whatever data the drone had recorded. As the two left, Dr. Sandoval continued setting up her compact laboratory in a corner room. She plugged in a portable power supply and arranged several sealed containers on a table. Grayson observed her actions from a distance, still uncertain about the scientist's exact purpose. Dr. Rhodes typed rapidly on a tablet, referencing medical diagrams and chemical formulas that were not part of the standard Army database. Meanwhile, Grayson assigned Corporal Davis to secure the perimeter around the police station. Davis checked the building's rear exit, stacking sandbags near a narrow back door for additional cover. The quiet outside felt unsettling. Grayson walked the length of the hallway, passing interrogation rooms and battered file cabinets. Everything was out of place. Yet no official explanation had been provided. An hour later, Klein and Torres returned from their reconnaissance. They described what they found near the forest edge. The drone lay shattered against a rock, its camera lens crushed. Footprints surrounded the crash site. Torres held up her phone to show images. The tracks were large, reminiscent of a bear's hind paw, but the toe spacing was elongated. Each indent suggested formidable weight. Alongside the footprints, they discovered the half-eaten carcass of a deer. The animal's torso was torn open, revealing exposed ribs and muscle tissue. Strange parallel cuts ran along the remaining flesh, suggesting sharp claws. Bits of fur clung to the deer's hide, but the color was unusual. It was dark, with thick strands that did not match local wildlife. Klein reported a strong, unpleasant odor lingering in the air. Grayson felt a wave of unease. Standard predators rarely left such specific traces. The scientists immediately requested the fur samples, along with any tissue fragments from the deer. Torres handed over sealed plastic pouches. Dr. Sandoval examined them under a portable microscope, making brief notes. She mentioned an abnormal structure in the hair shafts, but she withheld any conclusive analysis. Night approached quickly. Grayson directed the team to reinforce the station's entrances with barricades and motion detectors. Dr. Rhodes placed infrared sensors along the building's perimeter. The air temperature dropped further as darkness fell. Grayson climbed to an upper floor, scanning the deserted streets through a cracked window. Dim streetlights flickered, casting weak illumination over scattered debris. Davis interrupted the silence with a status check. All sensors were functional, and no activity had been reported in the last hour. The scientists remained focused on their samples, discussing protein markers and tissue anomalies in hushed voices. Grayson realized that their involvement was crucial, yet their secrecy irritated him. He approached Dr. Sandoval, asking if there was any immediate finding. She responded that tests were preliminary and refused to speculate. At 2100 hours, Klein did a final patrol of the exterior. The main thoroughfare remained empty, and the wind carried a faint hint of ozone. Grayson prepared for the possibility of an overnight engagement, though the mission parameters suggested the threat might be deeper in the forest. He ordered the team to rest in shifts, keeping weapons at hand. The unexplained bullet holes in the station's walls lingered in his thoughts. Before he settled, Grayson reviewed the day's footage on a rugged laptop. The drone's brief glimpse of motion near the trees replayed repeatedly. There was a shape among the pines, upright and large. That single frame triggered questions he could not answer. He closed the laptop and glanced at the locked door behind which Dr. Rhodes and Dr. Sandoval whispered over unknown data. Grayson reflected on the bullet impacts in the station walls, the destroyed drone, and the gruesome deer remains. He knew the morning would bring more questions. For now, the objective was simple: contain the area, protect his squad, and learn the nature of the menace that had emptied this town without leaving any official trace. Darkness settled over the deserted streets, and the temperature dropped further. The improvised base inside the old police station felt claustrophobic under the dim emergency lights. Captain Grayson conferred with Sergeant Klein about the watch rotation. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes continued analyzing fur and tissue samples in their cramped lab space. Shortly before midnight, a motion sensor outside the west entrance tripped. Corporal Davis rushed to check the monitor. The infrared camera displayed a tall figure moving along the edge of town. Grayson observed the live feed from a small screen. The subject appeared bipedal, with a height exceeding 7 feet. Its heat signature was bright, indicating a warm-blooded organism, though the shape was distorted. Grayson directed Davis to activate an exterior floodlight. The beam cut across the empty street. The camera feed flickered as the figure stopped moving. Then the monitor went black. Sensing trouble, Grayson ordered everyone to their positions. The team took defensive stances near the barricaded doors. Klein peered through a side window, straining to see any silhouette. Nothing emerged. Several tense minutes passed without further alarm. Dr. Sandoval quietly asked if there had been a malfunction. Grayson shook his head, certain the sensor had detected something. Davis volunteered to scout outside with Torres, but Grayson refused. The risk was high, and the shape on the monitor did not resemble any normal human or animal. He decided to wait, suspecting the entity might test their vigilance. At 0100 hours, a second sensor triggered near the northern perimeter. The static-laden camera showed a large, upright form moving in erratic bursts. The images flicked, revealing limbs longer than average arms. The top of the figure's head appeared to have pointed ears or extended tufts of fur. Grayson could not discern exact details due to the poor resolution, but the presence was undeniable. Klein raised his rifle, pointing at the barricaded window, though no target was visible outside. Dr. Rhodes stood behind him, monitoring the handheld console that tracked sensor data. A heavy impact rattled the station's rear door. The metal hinges groaned. Grayson signaled to hold fire until an actual breach occurred. The door shook again, but it did not give way. Then the noise stopped. Grayson counted off seconds, listening for movement. The corridor fell silent. He ordered Davis and Klein to secure the rear exit. They found deep scratches gouged into the metal exterior. The scratches formed parallel lines about 5 inches apart. No footprints were visible on the concrete, but the marks suggested large, powerful claws. Dr. Sandoval stepped into the hallway, carefully examining the damaged door with a flashlight. She used a sterile swab to collect residue from the grooves. Her expression indicated a growing realization. Grayson pressed for answers, but Dr. Sandoval kept her observations technical. She mentioned that the pattern of the scratches matched the first sample's unique morphology, implying a single specimen might be responsible for multiple incidents. At dawn, the team regrouped in the main reception area. Sleep had been minimal, and tensions were high. Grayson assigned Corporal Davis and Private Torres to watch the building's front. Klein and Dr. Rhodes set up additional sensors around the second floor. Dr. Sandoval prepared to run new tests on the claw residue. Grayson took a moment to review everything recorded overnight. Shortly after sunrise, another sensor alarm sounded. This time it indicated movement near the western boundary of the forest. Davis and Torres, guided by Grayson, moved cautiously through abandoned backyards and over collapsed fences. They reached a vantage point behind an old hardware store. From there, they could observe the tree line without being exposed. In the distance, the faint outline of a tall, hunched form crossed between thick trunks. It walked slowly, each step deliberate. Through binoculars, Torres noticed what appeared to be a head shaped like a canid with an extended snout. The creature paused, turning slightly. It sniffed the air. Its posture and slow movements displayed an unsettling blend of human-like gait and animalistic features. Davis signaled for a possible shot. Grayson, watching through his own binoculars, saw that the distance was too great for accurate fire. He ordered them to hold position and gather visual evidence. The creature vanished behind dense foliage, leaving only the rustle of branches. Davis secured the binoculars and waited for further instructions. Grayson guided them to return. As they retreated, they spotted a fresh set of footprints in the mud. These tracks matched the earlier impressions discovered near the drone crash site, only deeper. The spacing of the toes indicated large, curved claws. No standard predator in Montana possessed such features. Grayson photographed the prints for the scientists to analyze. Back at the station, Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes examined the new images. They compared them with the fur and tissue samples. Dr. Rhodes pointed out the unusual cellular structures. He suggested that the organism might exhibit heightened regenerative capabilities, akin to certain reptiles that regrow tissue, but on a far more advanced scale. The data was inconclusive, but it hinted at a biological anomaly beyond conventional wildlife. As afternoon approached, the team prepared for a possible confrontation. Grayson ordered the installation of additional cameras on rooftops around the station. Klein and Davis took turns climbing ladders, mounting infrared and low-light devices. Dr. Sandoval requested any recovered biological matter for immediate testing. She believed direct observation of living tissue would yield the clearest insights, though capturing a live specimen seemed impossible given the creature's apparent size and aggression. At 1800 hours, the first camera feed captured movement along the western perimeter. A tall figure moved in and out of the trees, sometimes vanishing from view. Grayson watched from a monitor inside the station, feeling a deepening sense of urgency. This was the third sighting in less than 24 hours, and the pattern suggested the creature was testing the boundaries of the town. He directed Klein to position the squad for a potential intercept. The plan involved overlapping fields of fire from windows and rooftops. Dr. Rhodes quietly reminded Grayson of the specialized ammunition loaded in their weapons. He pointed out that the combination of steel and silver had been specifically mandated, indicating an official belief that conventional rounds might not be fully effective. As darkness crept in again, the feed from the western cameras flickered. The figure was larger in the low-light image than anticipated, standing at least 2.5 meters tall. It paused near a rusted chain-link fence, raising its head. Its elongated limbs twitched, and the eyes reflected the camera's infrared beam. Then the picture dissolved into static. Klein radioed that he heard a guttural growl echo through the deserted streets. Grayson ordered the team to converge on the north corridor, hoping to ambush the creature if it passed near the station. They arrived at the position, weapons trained on shattered windows. Moments stretched into tense silence. No further movement registered on the sensors. Grayson signaled the team to stand down, deciding to wait until full daylight to pursue the entity. Whatever it was, it demonstrated caution around their defenses. He wondered if it recognized the threat of their firearms. Dr. Rhodes and Dr. Sandoval appeared disturbed by the repeated sightings, conferring in hushed tones. Grayson overheard words like rapid adaptation, predatory intelligence, and accelerated healing. With no immediate target, the team returned to a guarded alert state. Grayson updated command via encrypted channel, reporting a series of confirmed encounters with a large bipedal creature. The response arrived swiftly, instructing them to continue the mission without reinforcements. Grayson clenched his jaw, aware that the operation's scope was expanding beyond a routine wildlife containment. He ordered everyone to rest while they could, anticipating another encounter before long. Daylight arrived with a pale sky over the evacuated town. Captain Grayson gathered Delta 7 in the police station's main corridor to plan a reconnaissance deeper into the forest. The events of the previous night confirmed that the creature was real and likely responsible for the violent attacks. Grayson wanted concrete evidence and a chance to neutralize the threat before more lives were lost. Sergeant Klein unrolled a topographic map on a battered table. He pointed to a zone northwest of the town where the hills rose sharply. A marked footpath led through dense clusters of pine. That route connected to an old hunting cabin indicated on older survey records. Grayson decided to check the cabin for signs of prior encounters. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes requested to accompany the team, hoping to collect samples or forensic data. Corporal Davis and Private Torres prepared equipment for the excursion. They packed rations, medical supplies, extra ammunition, and portable motion sensors. Dr. Rhodes wrapped delicate instruments in protective casing, explaining that soil and tissue samples from remote areas might reveal additional clues about the creature's habitat. Grayson approved the inclusion of these items, though he insisted that safety took precedence over research. By 0700 hours, they departed the station in 2 vehicles. The streets remained deserted, flanked by empty storefronts and abandoned cars. As they advanced beyond the outskirts, the forest rose before them, thick with towering evergreens. Grayson parked near a narrow trailhead. Fog clung to the trees, and the scent of damp earth permeated the air. The group proceeded on foot, weapons raised. The path was uneven, covered by fallen branches and patches of snow. Occasional footprints hinted at past human presence, though many tracks were old and partially erased by weather. Klein led the way, checking every few yards for fresh marks. After half a mile, they encountered large prints in the mud. They resembled the ones photographed near the drone crash, with elongated toes and deep claw impressions. Grayson signaled for silence. Dr. Sandoval knelt to take samples of the surrounding soil, carefully storing them in labeled vials. She noted that the ground was disturbed more than once, indicating multiple visits or repeated pacing by the same entity. Dr. Rhodes compared the print spacing to standard human strides, confirming that they were longer and heavier, suggesting significant muscle mass. They pressed on, the tension growing with each step. The forest canopy filtered the sunlight, making the trail dim. Strange marks appeared on several tree trunks, including scratches too high for an ordinary animal. Torres snapped photos. Klein remarked that the parallel grooves were consistent with the claws that had gouged the station door. Grayson acknowledged the observation, feeling a mounting certainty about their quarry's path. Within an hour, they reached the old hunting cabin. The structure stood in a small clearing, its wooden walls weathered by years of exposure. The windows were broken, and the front door dangled from splintered hinges. The interior smelled of rotted wood and stale air. Tattered furniture lay scattered, and an old lantern stood overturned near a stone fireplace. Inside, they discovered scattered personal belongings: boots, a torn backpack, and a rusted hunting rifle with its barrel bent. Dry bloodstains marred the walls. Grayson spotted words etched into a supporting beam. "He hears." The letters were jagged, as if carved in desperation. Dr. Sandoval photographed them while Dr. Rhodes examined the rifle. He noted unusual impact damage that suggested extreme force applied to the metal. Under a loose floorboard, Corporal Davis found skeletal remains wearing remnants of a military uniform. The cloth bore a faded logo, a triangle with a sun emblem and the words Helios Division. Grayson recalled that name from obscure references in older classified reports. Rumors pointed to experiments in bioengineering, though official documents never provided details. Dr. Sandoval confirmed that these remains showed signs of violent trauma, including deep cuts along the ribs. They secured the cabin, searching for additional clues. An old journal lay torn beside the fireplace. The water-damaged pages were barely legible. Only a few lines hinted at a fearsome presence stalking the woods. The entries mentioned unnatural speed, abnormal strength, and a relentless pursuit. Grayson felt a chill, recalling the creature's behavior near the police station. While Dr. Rhodes bagged the journal fragments, Klein stepped outside to launch a small scouting drone. The device ascended, capturing aerial footage of the surrounding area. The feed showed a rocky outcrop less than half a mile away, where the forest thinned. Nestled at the base of those rocks appeared a shadowy recess that resembled an entrance to a cave. The drone's camera zoomed in, then abruptly lost signal. Klein relayed the coordinates to Grayson, who decided the cave warranted investigation. He directed Torres to remain near the cabin as a relay point, setting up a temporary communication station. The rest of the team would move toward the outcrop on foot. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes insisted on joining, citing the need for direct observation of any lair the creature might have established. On the approach, the trees grew denser, and the ground rose in a gradual incline. Grayson signaled for minimal noise. The stench of decaying vegetation hung in the cold air. The wind rustled through the pine needles, providing intermittent cover for their movements. As they advanced, Klein noted fresh claw marks on several fallen logs, each matching the creature's pattern. Suddenly, a distant roar echoed through the forest. The sound was low and extended, carrying a harsh vibration. Grayson froze, scanning the area with his rifle raised. Dr. Sandoval gripped her sample case, looking unsettled. The team pressed on, wary of an ambush. Every few steps, the roar seemed to shift direction, as if circling them from various angles. Eventually they reached a stretch of boulders marking the base of the rocky slope. Among the shadows, a narrow opening was visible, partly concealed by thick brush. Grayson edged closer, noticing dried blood along the stone. The marks indicated something large had moved in or out recently. Klein spotted hair stuck to a jagged edge. Dr. Rhodes collected it, confirming the same coarse strands they had analyzed earlier. Grayson motioned for silence. The mouth of the cave appeared shallow from the outside. He switched on a tactical flashlight, illuminating an uneven tunnel. The air inside smelled of damp rock and old decay. Scratches on the walls suggested this was more than a random shelter. Dr. Sandoval pointed out distinct patterns in the gouges, hinting at repeated scratching rather than accidental scraping. Before venturing any deeper, Grayson ordered the team to halt. He wanted to regroup with Torres and assess the best approach. The creature, if cornered inside a confined space, could be dangerous beyond normal comprehension. He recognized that a direct assault in such terrain was risky. Dr. Rhodes stressed the importance of gathering samples, but Grayson insisted on caution. As they stepped away from the cave entrance, Grayson instructed Klein to mark the coordinates for future reference. They would return with a clearer plan, possibly setting traps or remote sensors. The last thing he wanted was to rush into an enclosed area with limited visibility against a lethal predator of unknown origin. They moved back through the forest, guided by familiar landmarks. The lingering roar had faded, replaced by the occasional crack of branches underfoot. Torres made contact via radio, reporting a quiet perimeter around the cabin. By the time the team reunited with her, the sun was leaning westward, casting long shadows across the clearing. Grayson informed everyone of the discovered cave, emphasizing the need for a strategic approach. Dr. Sandoval studied the latest hair samples, remarking on thick follicles designed to endure harsh conditions. Dr. Rhodes prepared slides to examine possible regenerative tissue from the cave scratches. Grayson thought about the twisted rifle back in the cabin and the skeletal remains of someone tied to Helios Division. He sensed the truth behind Operation Beast was more tangled than any official briefing suggested. Their next move would be deliberate, he decided. They had identified a likely lair, confirmed signs of violent behavior, and recovered partial evidence of a military connection. The final steps to neutralize this threat would demand precision, planning, and an acceptance that the entity they faced was far from ordinary. Early the next morning, Captain Grayson studied the newly acquired maps and photographs alongside Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes. The suspected cave lay at the base of steep rocks, surrounded by dense pines. The creature had shown territorial behavior, marking trees and rotting carcasses. Grayson resolved to confirm whether the cave served as its primary lair. Sergeant Klein and Corporal Davis prepared ropes, flashlights, and portable floodlights. Grayson outlined the plan. The team would approach the cave entrance with caution and secure the perimeter. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes would remain just outside, ready to collect biological evidence once the area was declared safe. Private Torres would monitor communications near a vantage point above the rocks. They left before sunrise, using a two-vehicle convoy to reach the forest's edge. Torches of morning light crept through the trees as they disembarked and advanced on foot. The silence was thick, broken only by the shuffle of boots through undergrowth. Occasional gusts of wind rattled the branches overhead. When they arrived at the cave entrance, Grayson signaled for a halt. No fresh claw marks appeared on the surrounding boulders. Dried blood remained on the stones, suggesting older events. The air smelled stale and damp. Klein switched on a floodlight and aimed it into the dark mouth. Shadows flickered across the rocky interior. Dr. Sandoval placed a sampling kit on the ground. She was prepared to retrieve any tissue fragments inside the cave, provided it was safe. Grayson and Davis moved in first, rifles raised. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move single file. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, creating puddles on the uneven floor. Faint scratches covered the walls, forming spiraling patterns that intensified deeper within. About 20 feet in, they discovered remnants of animal bones piled against a rock. Klein identified deer antlers and partial remains of smaller mammals. Some bones showed deep gouges consistent with a powerful bite or sharp claws. Grayson wondered if the creature cached prey here. The stench of decay hinted that these kills were not recent, though no insects buzzed in the cold space. Pressing on, they found a broader chamber. The walls bore deep grooves, radiating outward in curved lines. Patches of dried blood stained the stone. Davis crouched to examine cloth scraps lying near the far side of the chamber. They looked like torn clothing, possibly from a human victim. Among them lay twisted dog tags. Grayson held them up to the light, wiping away grime to read partial engraving. The name was unreadable, but the Helios Division logo was faintly visible. Suddenly, a rattling breath echoed from a deeper recess. Grayson froze. He flicked his flashlight beam across the rock, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the chamber. The sound repeated, resonating with wet gulps. Klein tensed, his grip steady on his rifle. Grayson gestured for a silent retreat, unwilling to risk a direct confrontation in the cramped darkness. They moved back toward the entrance, hoping to regroup. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes watched them emerge, both scientists eager for an update. Grayson described the chamber and the possible presence of the creature beyond. Dr. Sandoval stepped forward with collection tools. She wanted samples of the dried blood on the walls. Grayson approved, keeping Davis and Klein close by. While the scientists worked, Private Torres communicated from her overlook. She reported no visual movement around the cave exterior, but her vantage point was limited by thick pine coverage. Grayson suggested they evacuate the cave before sunrise brightened the forest further. If the creature was still inside, an ambush could happen at any moment. As Dr. Sandoval carefully scraped blood from the stone, a growl rose from the darkness. It was distant yet forceful. Without hesitation, Grayson ordered an immediate withdrawal. The scientists packed their samples, and the team backed away from the entrance. Another growl cut through the cold air, followed by the sound of shifting stones deeper within. They reached daylight, weapons drawn. The forest was still. No sign of movement flickered among the pines. Grayson established a perimeter around the cave while the team hastened to the vehicles. Dr. Rhodes clutched a sealed vial of clotted blood, expression focused on the potential breakthroughs it could offer. Grayson cared only for the safety of his squad. Once in relative security, they radioed Torres to stand by for extraction. The sense of an unseen presence loomed. Grayson knew they had found the creature's den, but fully engaging it in such a location was suicidal. He resolved to force it out into open ground, where their coordinated firepower would have a greater advantage. The day's reconnaissance confirmed the worst. The creature had made that cave a killing ground. Bloodstains, twisted dog tags, and the Helios Division emblem all hinted at a hidden military experiment. Dr. Sandoval's samples and Dr. Rhodes's data would help unravel the biology behind its monstrous strength. For now, Delta 7's priority was to prepare a strategic trap rather than risk additional casualties in the claustrophobic dark. Captain Adam Grayson had barely finished securing the watch post near the abandoned sawmill when a sudden call crackled over the radio. Sergeant Klein, perched atop a crumbling loading dock with his sniper rifle, had spotted rapid movement at the tree line. Morning light offered poor visibility through rising fog, and the squad tensed, scanning every shadow with anxious precision. Grayson positioned Corporal Davis behind a dilapidated pickup truck, while Private Torres swept her sector near a row of rusted barrels. The scientists, Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes, remained inside a makeshift command point under protective cover. A moment later, a dark shape burst from the forest at surprising speed. Through binoculars, Grayson saw a tall, fur-covered figure sprint in a zigzag pattern, as if testing each vantage point. In a blur, it vaulted a chain-link fence and bounded across broken asphalt. Klein's sniper rifle barked once, the bullet striking the creature's shoulder and causing it to stagger. Yet it recovered almost instantly, unleashing a guttural roar that resonated through the damp air. Ignoring the rest of the squad, the creature charged directly toward Klein's elevated nest. Its tactical precision was alarming. It moved with a sense of purpose, focusing first on neutralizing the long-range threat. Klein fired another round, the specialized silver-steel core bullet tearing into the creature's side. It howled and lurched, but did not fall. Reaching the base of the structure, it scrambled up the corroded metal supports. Klein tried to chamber a fresh round, but the creature lunged with outstretched claws, slashing the sniper's arm and sending him sprawling. A cry came through the radio, abrupt and strained. Corporal Davis, seeing Klein in danger, sprinted forward, firing short bursts. Each impact drew more of that thick, tar-like blood, but the beast twisted away, almost anticipating the line of fire. Private Torres provided covering shots, pushing the creature to drop from the platform. It landed heavily on all fours, muscles coiling with unsettling power. Then its eyes locked onto Specialist O'Neill, the squad's machine gunner who stood near a barricade of discarded pallets. O'Neill unleashed a barrage of suppressive fire, the heavy weapon pounding the morning air. Dozens of silver steel rounds impacted the creature's hide, drawing more black fluid, but none of the hits were decisive. Without warning, it shifted direction and rushed O'Neill. A single leap brought it within striking range. Despite O'Neill's frantic effort to angle his weapon, the beast swiped with razor-sharp claws, tearing through Kevlar plating. The force of the blow knocked O'Neill onto his back. Before the rest of the team could intervene, the creature raked its hand across his chest, ripping through flesh and protective layers alike. Grayson shouted for the squad to concentrate fire, his voice hoarse from exertion. Bullets tore at the creature's flank, but it persisted long enough to deliver a fatal strike to O'Neill's throat. Blood soaked the ground as the machine gunner's weapon clattered from limp fingers. The beast, now wounded and snarling, twisted around, scanning for its next target. Gouts of that strange black blood dripped from ragged wounds where the specialized rounds had torn chunks of fur and tissue. Sergeant Klein, despite his injury, managed to steady his rifle and fire one more shot. The bullet grazed the creature's neck, causing it to let out a furious, rumbling growl. Under heavy gunfire from Torres and Davis, the beast recoiled, stumbling away from O'Neill's body. It bounded across rubble and leapt back over the chain-link fence, disappearing into the fog. Grayson rushed to O'Neill, kneeling in the spreading pool of blood. He realized the machine gunner was gone, eyes vacant and lifeless. Fury mixed with horror as Grayson pressed a trembling hand to the torn, ballistic vest. He could do nothing. A few yards away, Klein clutched his bleeding arm, gasping from pain. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes, hearing the chaos subside, emerged cautiously, carrying a first aid kit and medical instruments. While Dr. Sandoval helped bandage Klein, Dr. Rhodes extracted an ampullae, offering it to Grayson. Grayson followed the creature's thick trail of inky blood, gathering a sample. The black fluid clung to the container's sides with a viscous consistency. He discovered a pair of bullets that appeared to have been forced from the beast's flesh, each one partially deformed and covered in dark residue. The mutated tissue around these slugs fascinated Dr. Rhodes, who slipped them into a sealed evidence pouch. With O'Neill's body wrapped in a tarp, the team regrouped. Klein's wound was severe but not immediately life-threatening. The entire squad felt rattled, having witnessed the creature's speed and calculated ferocity. Grayson stared at O'Neill's covered form, jaw clenched in grief. He directed Corporal Davis to radio for an update to command, reporting the casualty and the monstrous adversary's capability. Their specialized rounds had drawn blood, but the beast had survived far worse than any normal predator could endure. The shock of Specialist O'Neill's death weighed heavily on the squad as they returned to their makeshift base inside the old police station. Captain Grayson had insisted on driving himself, ignoring the throbbing ache in his shoulder from bruises earned during the fight. The mood in the transport was somber, punctuated by labored breathing from Sergeant Klein, whose bandaged arm still bled through the gauze. Corporal Davis and Private Torres rode in silence, faces etched with grim exhaustion. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes clutched their medical kits and sample cases, reluctant to speak. Upon arrival, Grayson contacted command through the encrypted channel. He described the creature's capacity for evasion, the lethal efficiency it displayed, and the tragic loss of O'Neill. Hoping for reinforcements or an extraction order, he requested immediate backup. The response stunned him. Command insisted they remain in the area, continue the mission, and gather more data. There would be no additional support. They were to eliminate the threat regardless of further risk. Fury rose inside Grayson, who slammed his fist against a rusted locker. Delta-7 had trained for high-risk missions, but none of them had expected a confrontation with such a powerful, inhuman adversary. The loss of O'Neill compounded that frustration, and Klein's injury underscored the dangers they faced. Grayson forced himself to breathe, refusing to let anger cloud his judgment. Another confrontation would come soon enough, and they needed every advantage they could muster. While Dr. Sandoval administered painkillers to Klein and replaced his dressing, Dr. Rhodes carefully unpacked the bullets Grayson had recovered from the beast's blood trail. Each slug contained traces of a peculiar protein. Observing them under a portable microscope, Dr. Rhodes muttered that the sample bore partial similarities to reptilian tissue known for regenerating body parts, but also displayed traits reminiscent of canine biology, particularly that of wolves. His excitement was palpable, as if he had stumbled upon an unprecedented scientific breakthrough. Grayson hovered near, torn between wanting answers and adhering to the direct order forbidding interference with the scientist's work. He watched Dr. Rhodes examine the black residue clinging to the deformed slugs, noting how the fluid reconstituted when exposed to certain chemical reagents. Dr. Sandoval joined him, whispering observations about complex cellular structures that seemed resistant to conventional breakdown. "It's like a fusion of reptile and mammal," Dr. Rhodes said, scribbling notes. "It can repair tissues in ways I haven't seen. Incredible." Grayson clenched his jaw, uneasy about how enthralled they seemed by the discovery. O'Neill was dead, Klein was wounded, and they had a monstrous foe still roaming the perimeter. He turned away, deciding that pushing them for specifics would achieve little. Command had made it clear. The scientist's job was to study, and Delta-7's role was to fight. He gathered Davis and Torres in a cramped corner of the station to formulate a response plan. They discussed positioning sniper coverage on rooftops, placing tripwire alarms around likely approach routes, and sealing vulnerable entry points. Klein's injuries limited his mobility, but he could still provide overwatch if they placed him in a stable vantage position. Grayson considered requesting that Dr. Sandoval assist with constructing homemade deterrents, but he dismissed the idea, not wanting to distract the research team. As night fell, Grayson stepped outside to check the perimeter. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, reminding him of the creature's blood. His thoughts circled around the possibility that the beast was more than a random experiment. Helios Division, secret military labs, silver-infused ammunition, everything pointed to a hidden agenda. He stared at the boarded windows of nearby buildings, imagining the terror the local population might have endured before the forced evacuation. Inside, Dr. Rhodes and Dr. Sandoval hovered over their instruments. Grayson's ear caught fragments of their excited conversation about accelerated healing, mutated proteins, and potential triggers. The words endless potential grated on his nerves, given the lethal consequences this phenomenon had already inflicted on them. Frustrated, he tried to calm himself by reorganizing the team's supply crates. Ammunition was running low. The specialized bullets they possessed were finite, and Command had shown no intention of sending more. Another encounter with the creature would likely be more vicious than the last, especially now that it had observed their tactics. He contemplated the next logical step. luring the beast out of its lair on favorable ground. Without that advantage, they faced a stalemate or worse. At midnight, Grayson updated command once more, providing scans of Dr. Rhodes's preliminary findings. The official response was curt, praising them for their continued efforts and instructing them to press on. No mention of extraction. No condolences for O'Neill's death. Grayson seethed but kept his composure. He refused to let his emotions undermine the squad's survival. As he settled near a flickering lamp in the station's back room, he closed his eyes and pictured a trap that might corner the creature. Perhaps using fresh bait, setting explosives near the cave, or feigning weakness in an exposed position. The plan began to take shape in his mind, fueled by the realization that nothing about this mission was normal. He understood that he would have to act decisively or risk more deaths in a confrontation that could spiral out of control. Morning broke over the silent town, offering a stark contrast to the intensity Captain Grayson felt while reviewing the final plan. His decision to split Delta 7 into 2 units was calculated, rooted in the harsh lessons learned from earlier encounters. He assigned Sergeant Klein to lead the diversion team in the forest, ensuring that the creature would be drawn away from its lair by the scent of raw meat and fresh blood. Meanwhile, Grayson would head the second group at the cave, where he intended to lay improvised explosives and seal the beast's escape route once it returned. Before leaving the police station, Klein's squad collected large chunks of venison and canisters of donated human blood from field medics' reserves. Each container exuded a pungent odor that clung to the soldiers' gear. Klein selected 2 volunteers, Privates Collins and Haynes, to assist him in deploying the bait along narrow paths deeper in the woods. They understood that exposing themselves so blatantly carried grave risk, but the team had run out of safer alternatives. Grayson, accompanied by Corporal Davis and Private Torres, plus 1 remaining scientist, Dr. Sandoval, departed in a separate vehicle. Dr. Sandoval insisted on gathering data from the cave itself, though she agreed to stay behind cover when the time came for open conflict. Grayson navigated back roads until they reached the rugged slope near the cave's entrance. Signs of the monster's presence lingered in old footprints and freshly scratched bark, reminding them of its territorial patterns. They advanced on foot, carrying specially adapted charges that Grayson had prepared overnight. Each device was packed with shredded steel-silver fragments derived from their stock of modified bullets. If detonated within the confined stone walls, the blast could incapacitate or fatally wound any occupant, provided the creature ventured inside. Grayson spent an hour studying the cave's approach, noting where boulders and rock overhangs could amplify the explosions. Corporal Davis and Private Torres worked methodically, planting remote detonation charges along each side of the entrance. They concealed wires behind natural ridges, ensuring minimal visibility. Dr. Sandoval stayed back, collecting stray samples of the tar-like blood left behind from previous skirmishes. Grayson scanned the tree line for any sign of movement, his rifle ready. By midday, Klein's voice came through the radio. His group had scattered the raw meat across a secluded glade roughly 3/4 of a mile away. They poured blood trails around the perimeter, forming a reeking circle that could lure the beast. Klein's tone was cautious, indicating that they had sensed an ominous stillness in the forest. Grayson reminded him to stay prepared for a violent reaction, warning that the creature might appear from any direction. Hours passed as both groups maintained their positions. Grayson stood near a rock ledge, tension building with each breath. Dr. Sandoval conducted a brief test on a sliver of the blackened blood, quietly remarking on its unusual capacity to coagulate in variable temperatures. Grayson offered no reply, focusing on distant sounds carried by shifting air currents. The forest felt oppressively quiet. Close to dusk, frantic gunfire erupted through the radio channel. Klein shouted fragmented instructions, ordering Collins and Haynes to spread out. The hiss of static masked part of his words, but Grayson understood the key points. The creature had taken the bait, attacking with brutal speed. One soldier's scream cut short, replaced by a barrage of suppressed rifle fire. Grayson gripped his weapon, powerless to assist from his distant vantage. Minutes later, Klein's voice returned, breathless and grim. The monster had killed Private Haynes with a swift, savage assault. Collins had been wounded but was still alive, and Klein himself was forced to retreat deeper into the woods under relentless pursuit. The creature, though injured, remained formidable. Grayson clenched his jaw, murmuring a terse acknowledgement. Their plan had succeeded in drawing the beast out, but the cost was another life. As dusk settled into night, Grayson maintained radio contact with Klein's team, listening to updates of the creature's movements. Blood trails and gunshots echoed from the forest, carrying faintly on the wind. Corporal Davis finalized the explosive triggers, verifying that each device was functional. Private Torres found a defensive position to support Grayson in the final encounter. Dr. Sandoval steadied her camera and sample kit, uneasy yet committed. In the final transmission of the evening, Klein reported that the creature had abruptly broken off the chase, perhaps sensing the futility of continuing deeper into unfamiliar terrain. It was likely heading back toward its lair, wounded and enraged. Grayson gripped the radio, quietly telling Klein to regroup safely if possible. The trap was set, and all that remained was to wait for the monster to return home, where explosive charges and a determined team stood ready to end the nightmare once and for all. Nightfall draped the rocky slope in layers of shadow and tension. Captain Grayson crouched behind an outcrop a dozen yards from the cave. Corporal Davis and Private Torres positioned nearby. Small blinking indicators on a handheld trigger panel confirmed that the explosives lining the entrance remained armed. Dr. Sandoval hid slightly downhill, ready to record crucial evidence while staying out of harm's direct path. Radio updates from Sergeant Klein had grown sporadic. His group, exhausted and battered, had managed to evade the creature after a vicious pursuit. Though Klein reported minor injuries, he insisted they were safe enough to hold their position until daylight. The beast, presumably wounded, had veered away from their final stand, drawn instinctively back to its lair for refuge. By midnight, sporadic gusts of wind stirred dust across the rocks, heightening every nerve. Grayson's gaze swept the tree line below, scanning for the first sign of movement. Corporal Davis pressed a blood-stained gauze pad against his own shoulder, where a stray fragment from an earlier skirmish had grazed him. Private Torres monitored the hillside with night vision gear, ready to open fire at the slightest flash of motion. Around 0100 hours, faint rustling carried through the still air. Shadows shifted near a fallen trunk at the perimeter of their vantage. Grayson exhaled slowly, raising his rifle. The creature emerged, outlined by flickering moonlight. Its posture was ragged and hunched, large patches of fur matted with clotted black fluid. It paused, snout lifting as it caught the human scent that clung to the rocks. Corporal Davis signaled readiness, eyes locked on the creature's silhouette. The beast advanced in unsteady strides, favoring a wounded flank. Once it spotted movement on the hillside, it snarled, baring elongated fangs. Grayson allowed it to close the distance, determined to force the final confrontation inside the cave. With a curt hand gesture, he urged Torres to fire a short burst. Bullets struck the ground near the beast's feet, provoking a fierce howl. Enraged, the monster bounded forward, slashing at the air as it charged up the slope. Grayson and Davis shifted position, loosing precise shots that hammered into the creature's side. Thick droplets of black fluid splattered the stony ground. Though hobbled by injuries, it lunged at Grayson, claw grazing his forearm in a painful swipe. He stumbled back, ignoring the searing wound, and continued firing. Private Torres intensified her barrage, forcing the beast to veer toward the cave. Each time it attempted to skirt away, the team boxed it in with overlapping fields of fire. Its snarls and ragged breathing echoed across the rock face. Realizing it was outmatched in open ground, the creature staggered toward the shadowy entrance, seeking cover from the hail of bullets. Dr. Sandoval, crouched at a safe distance, captured everything on her recording device, her expression reflecting both horror and grim resolve. She glimpsed Grayson pressing a hand to his bleeding arm before steadying his rifle once more. Corporal Davis and Private Torres advanced carefully, funneling the beast deeper into the mouth of the cave with relentless gunfire. As soon as the creature's hulking form vanished into the dark interior, Grayson screamed for everyone to take cover. He clutched the remote detonator, heart pounding. The monstrous roars from within reverberated off the stone walls. Without hesitation, he pressed the trigger. A thunderous explosion ripped through the hillside. Fire and debris blasted outward, and a rolling cloud of dust billowed from the cave entrance, blotting out the moonlight. Davis and Torres shielded their faces from the shower of gravel. Grayson remained behind the outcrop, bracing for aftershocks as the ground trembled. Dr. Sandoval ducked and covered her head, her equipment rattling from the force. When the echoes subsided, a choking silence fell. Portions of the cave mouth had collapsed, sealing layers of rock and twisted steel behind a rubble pile. A faint stirring caught Grayson's attention. Through the swirling dust, he saw a massive shape pinned beneath jagged debris. Limbs twitched, black fluid oozed, and a final growl slipped from the twisted jaws of the wounded beast. Its torso was crushed under fallen slabs, yet it clung to life with uncanny persistence. Grayson struggled to his feet, ignoring waves of pain in his arm. He moved closer, rifle ready, adrenaline overriding caution. The creature's eyes flared with a flicker of rage, though its body remained pinned. Without pause, Grayson fired an entire magazine at point-blank range into its head. Skull and fur disintegrated under repeated impacts. A final shudder passed through the beast's shredded frame, and it lay still, life finally extinguished. For a moment, no one spoke. The stench of cordite and blood overpowered the cool night air. Torres slowly approached, checking for any sign of movement. Corporal Davis exhaled in relief. Dr. Sandoval edged closer, still recording, stunned by the brutality, yet certain the monster could never rise again. Grayson swayed on his feet, battered and bleeding but resolute in his conviction that the mission was complete. The cave had become the creature's tomb, and his savage execution had ensured it would never escape. Morning light crept over the devastated landscape as a government-issue helicopter descended onto the battered football field outside the deserted town. Captain Grayson, flanked by Sergeant Klein and the remaining members of Delta 7, stood near the fated end zone, bracing themselves against the rotor wash. Dr. Sandoval and Dr. Rhodes waited alongside them, protective cases full of samples clutched tightly. The creature's corpse lay entombed beneath rock and rubble, but the evidence of its existence had been meticulously collected. A suited government agent stepped from the helicopter, his expression formal and reserved. He surveyed the group with dispassionate efficiency, offering terse thanks for completing Operation Beast. Without delay, he produced a sleek tablet and handed it to Dr. Sandoval. Grayson glanced at the screen during the exchange and caught sight of a line that read, Extended data on pathogen. Lycanthropin M recognition flashed in his mind. Their mission had not been merely to eliminate a threat. It was to gather proof of a weaponized virus that could transform living organisms into lethal predators. While Dr. Rhodes and Dr. Sandoval exchanged hushed remarks with the agent, Grayson remained silent. The official manner in which everything was wrapped up confirmed his darkest suspicions. Command had no intention of acknowledging the deeper implications of this creature's origins. They merely wanted confirmation that the experiment had proven viable. The monstrous adversary had been a living testament to what Helios Division might have unleashed. Within the hour, the helicopter took the survivors and their cargo away from the haunted town. All official records would soon mention a contained chemical spill, and no mention of an apex predator would appear in public dispatches. The hush order remained absolute. Despite the losses, Delta 7 was hailed as having fulfilled its duty. Grayson felt only a hollow resignation, aware that the threat was far from over. A week later, national news outlets reported a massive wildfire raging through the Montana forest. Footage showed flames devouring the pines, and aerial firefighting units dropping chemicals onto the blaze. Grayson watched this broadcast from his small apartment in a sprawling metropolis, physically recovered but troubled. That blaze was no accident. He recognized it as a systematic purge, meant to erase any lingering traces of the experiment. He turned off the television. The windows behind him reflected the city's lights, neon glare spilling across asphalt. Though safe at home, Grayson felt no relief. His instincts told him the operation's true purpose had not been about saving civilians. It had tested the reliability of specialized ammunition, the competence of an engineered predator, and the extremes to which an elite unit might go. Whether Lycanthropin M died with that single beast, or thrived elsewhere, remained unknown. He stepped toward the window, heart pounding with a sudden wave of apprehension. In the glass, he saw his own reflection, pale and drawn. Then, subtly at first, his features began to change. Muscles tensed beneath his skin, nails growing sharper, and his jawline shifted. The transformation was slow and dreadful, a horrifying realization that the infection had passed to him. Perhaps a claw scratch, or a speck of black blood, had seeped into his body. As his reflection twisted into something bestial, he pressed one hand against the cold pane, mouth open in silent shock. A deep ache rolled through his bones, and amber light glimmered in his eyes. In that final moment of clarity, he understood the monstrous legacy Helios Division had created. The mission had destroyed the original abomination, but it had not contained the contagion. Outside, traffic continued, unaware of the horror unfolding in a single apartment window. Grayson's last vestige of humanity slipped as the transformation advanced, condemning him to the same fate he had battled in the Montana wilderness.